I built that bridge in 1987, designed every bolt, poured every footing, inspected it every single October for 35 years. I was at the kitchen table with my coffee when I heard the equipment start up. I knew that sound, 14 years of county bridge work, an excavator, working hard. I put on my boots and walked out. When I came through the woodlot onto the creek bank, the excavator was on my bridge. 3 deck planks were already gone. The steel was exposed. A man with a clipboard was watching from the far side. He never looked up, never saw me standing there. I took 21 photographs in 4 minutes. Then I walked back to the farmhouse, opened my filing cabinet, and read page 3 of the easement. The HOA had one obligation: maintain the crossing structure. They demolished it instead, so I closed their road. All right, let's start at the very beginning. But first, where are you tuning in from today? Don't forget to like and subscribe. Earl had built the bridge in the late summer of 1987, a Thursday in August when the creek was low enough to work in, the Tanner Creek bed exposed between its banks, the water running shallow over the limestone shelf that made this particular crossing the logical place for a structure. He had been 39 years old, a civil engineer with 14 years of county road and bridge work behind him, and he had built the bridge the way he built everything. From drawings first, the pencil work done at the kitchen table over 3 evenings in July, the load calculations on a separate sheet, the timber sizing verified against the span tables in the AASHTO manual he kept on the shelf above his desk. The span was 22 feet, creek bank to creek bank at the crossing point, the bank's stable limestone underlain with good bearing capacity, no scour risk at the crossing's protected position inside the creek's gentle curve. He had designed for a 12-ton load rating, conservative for a private farm road, but Earl had learned from 14 years of county bridge work that under-designed structures required replacement and over-designed structures required maintenance, and he preferred maintenance to replacement. The 12-ton rating meant the structure could handle a loaded hay wagon, a fuel delivery truck, a full concrete mixer if he ever needed one on the property. It would handle any passenger vehicle or light truck that would ever use the road without noticing it was doing so. He had sourced the timber from a sawmill in the next county, treated southern yellow pine, the treatment specification written on the purchase order in Earl's hand. The mill owner's confirmation that the material met the specifications stapled to the purchase order in the file folder Earl had labeled Bridge-1987 the day he started the project. The steel had come from a fabricator in Knoxville, 2 W-section stringers, the flange dimensions calculated to Earl's drawings, the fabricator's mill certification attached to the invoice. He had hired 2 men from the county road department who did private work on weekends, men he had worked with for years, who understood how to set forms and pour footings and lift steel without creating the problems that came from working with people who did not know what they were doing on a bridge structure. The footings had gone in on a Monday, concrete poured into the formed excavations on both banks, the anchor bolts set to the template Earl had made from plywood in his workshop. He had let the footings cure for 7 days before he set the steel. The stringers had gone in on the following Monday, the 2 W sections lifted by the rented crane he had driven from Knoxville himself, each stringer set on the bearing plates and bolted to the anchor assemblies while Earl stood on the bank with the level and called adjustments. The timber deck had been 3 days, the treated planks cut to length in Earl's workshop, delivered to the site on the bed of his truck, fastened to the stringers with the lag pattern he had specified in the drawings. He had driven his loaded hay wagon across it on a Friday afternoon in September 1987, a full load of first-cutting hay, the wagon and load together just under 8 tons, the bridge carrying it without deflection he could measure with his eye. He had parked the wagon on the bridge and had walked its length and had looked at the deck planks, the stringers, the bearing connections, the footings. Everything was where he had put it. Everything was doing what he had designed it to do. He had opened the Bridge 1987 folder when he got back to the farmhouse and had written the first entry in the maintenance log, a lined composition notebook, the date in the upper left corner, the entry reading, Initial load test, hay wagon, approximately 8 tons, no visible deflection, deck planks tight, bearing connections solid, footings undisturbed, structure performing to design. He had been keeping that maintenance log ever since. The 180 acres had belonged to Howard Presley for 22 years before Earl bought them, Howard having acquired the property in 1989, 2 years after Earl built the bridge, in a transaction that had required Earl to negotiate a written license with Howard for the bridge's continued existence on what was now Howard's land. The license had been a 2-page instrument, informal by the standards of recorded property documents, but sufficient for the purpose. Howard acknowledging the bridge's existence on the property's southwestern creek crossing, Earl retaining the right to maintain and use the bridge for access to his adjacent timber and hay operation on the property's western section, the license running with the land. Earl and Howard had been neighbors in the uncomplicated way that rural Tennessee neighbors of their generation managed adjacency. A phone call when there was a question, an acknowledgement at the feed store, a general understanding that each man's land was his own, and that the bridge was Earl's structure on Howard's land, and that both of them understood the distinction without needing to discuss it further than the 2-page license required. Howard had been approached by Valley Ridge Partners in 2002, a development LLC out of Knoxville, 2 principals named Garrison and Webb, the company having identified the eastern section of Howard's 180 acres as a suitable site for a residential subdivision if road access could be established. The eastern section had no direct county road frontage. Its access depended on the private road that ran from the county highway across the southwestern corner of the property, over Earl's Bridge at the Tanner Creek crossing, and east along the valley floor to the eastern acreage. If Garrison and Webb could obtain a recorded easement for that road, the eastern section could be platted and permitted. Without the road easement, the eastern section had no legal access and no development value. Howard had been willing to discuss a sale of the eastern section, but had insisted on setting the easement terms before any sale agreement was reached. He had called Earl before he called Valley Ridge Partners back. He had said, "Earl, Howard, Valley Ridge Partners wants to buy my eastern section for a subdivision. They need the road access, your bridge and the road through the southwestern corner. I won't negotiate the easement without talking to you first." Earl had said, "What are they proposing?" Howard had said, "A standard recorded easement for the road corridor. I told them I'd discuss it, but that the bridge is yours, and any easement has to address that." Earl had said, "The bridge is mine, and I maintain it. If they want to use it for a subdivision road, they need to be responsible for its upkeep. I'm not maintaining a crossing for 40 families who aren't paying for it." Howard had said, "That's what I told them." The negotiation had taken 3 months. Valley Ridge Partners, represented by a Knoxville real estate attorney, Howard represented by his own counsel, Earl participating through the same attorney he used for property matters. The maintenance condition had been Howard's insistence and Earl's requirement simultaneously. Neither man had been willing to record an easement that did not address the bridge's upkeep. Valley Ridge Partners had pushed back initially, arguing that the crossing structure was Earl's responsibility as the owner, and that the subdivision residents should not bear the cost of maintaining a structure they did not build. Earl's attorney had responded that the structure was Earl's to own, and the easement holders to maintain as a condition of their access, that this was the arrangement, or there was no arrangement, and that Valley Ridge Partners could find another way into the eastern section if they disagreed. Valley Ridge Partners had agreed. The easement had been recorded in October 2003, Book 44, page 178, Harlan County Register of Deeds. The relevant condition on page 3 had read, "A non-exclusive easement for private road access across the described 340-foot corridor for the benefit of residential lots within the Ridgeline Estates subdivision plat. Said easement conditioned on the easement holder's maintenance of the crossing structure over Tanner Creek at the easement holder's expense and to the satisfaction of the property owner." Howard had sold the eastern section to Valley Ridge Partners in November 2003. Ridgeline Estates had been platted and permitted in 2004. The first families had moved in during the summer of 2004. 38 homes, Ridge Road running from the county highway, across Earl's southwestern corner and over the bridge and into the subdivision's internal road network. Earl had watched the subdivision go in from the western side of his property, the construction activity visible across the hayfield, the Ridge Road traffic increasing from 0 to the daily passage of 38 households over the course of a year. He had continued his annual bridge inspections in the fall of each year, the maintenance log entry made each October after he had walked the structure, checked the deck planks, examined the bearing connections, looked at the footing conditions. The entries had been consistent across the years, the deck planks tight, the stringers performing, the connections solid, the footings undisturbed. He had replaced 3 deck planks in 2009 when he found checking in the surface treatment and had applied a fresh coat of preservative to the timber deck in 2014 and 2019. The steel had been cleaned and painted in 2008 and 2016. The maintenance log recorded every action, every date, every material used, every observation made. Earl had bought the 180 acres from Howard Presley in March 2011. Howard retiring to his daughter's home in Chattanooga. The property sale, the last major transaction of Howard's rural Tennessee life. The purchase price had been $420,000. The transaction handled by the same attorney Earl had used for property matters since the bridge easement negotiation in 2003. He had read every instrument in the title chain before closing: the deed, the survey, the tax records, the existing easements and licenses. He had read the 2003 easement in full, including page 3, including the maintenance condition. He had noted it in the margin of his copy with a single annotation: HOA maintenance obligation, condition of easement, verify annually. He had called his attorney before closing and had said, "The subdivision easement has a maintenance condition for the bridge crossing. The condition says the easement holders maintain the structure at their expense and to my satisfaction as the property owner. I want to make sure I understand what I'm acquiring. The easement is on the property and I become the property owner who determines whether the maintenance is satisfactory." His attorney had said, "That is correct. When you acquire the property, you step into Howard Presley's position as the property owner referenced in the condition. The easement holder's maintenance obligation runs to you as the current property owner." Earl had said, "And if they don't maintain it?" His attorney had said, "Failure to maintain the crossing structure as required by the condition is a breach of the easement's material condition. A material breach of an easement condition is grounds for termination of the easement under Tennessee law." Earl had said, "I understand. Let's close." He had taken possession of the 180 acres in March 2011 and had conducted his first post-acquisition bridge inspection that October. The same fall inspection he had been conducting since 1987, the same composition notebook, the same methodical attention to the deck, the stringers, the connections, the footings. The entry had read, "Annual inspection, October 2011. Deck planks sound, no checking or splitting. Stringers clean, no surface corrosion beyond previous paint coverage. Bearing connections tight, footings undisturbed. Load rating confirmed at 12 tons. Structure performing to design. No action required." He had added one line at the bottom. "First inspection as property owner. Howard Presley's easement now runs to me. Maintenance condition noted." He had made the same entry, with variations, every October for the following 12 years. The bridge sound each year, the structure performing. The 38 families of Ridgeline Estates, crossing it twice a day in each direction without knowing or caring that the structure beneath their tires had been designed by the man who owned the land it sat on, and had been maintained by that same man since the summer of 1987, because the HOA that was supposed to maintain it under the terms of their road easement had never once in 18 years sent a crew, submitted a maintenance report, or asked Earl whether the structure they were required to maintain to his satisfaction was performing satisfactorily. Earl had noted that too. He had written it in the maintenance log in October 2015. The entry for that year's inspection closing with, "No communication from Ridgeline Estates HOA regarding maintenance condition. HOA has not submitted any maintenance report or contacted property owner regarding crossing structure condition in 11 years of easement operation. Maintenance condition on page 3 of recorded easement is HOA obligation. Condition has not been performed by HOA. Structure maintained by property owner only." He had written the same observation every October since 2015. The log was consistent. The HOA's maintenance record was consistent in a different way. 18 years of nothing. The subdivision had grown into itself over those years. 38 homes, the families cycling through as people moved in and moved on, the children who had grown up crossing Earl's Bridge on the school bus every morning, now themselves old enough to have children of their own. Ridge Road had been the neighborhood's only direct connection to the county highway from the beginning. The alternate route, a county road loop around the valley's northern end, added 22 minutes to the commute in each direction, and was what Ridgeline Estates residents used when Ridge Road was temporarily closed for weather or repaving. The bridge was the road, and the road was the neighborhood's artery, and Earl's maintenance log documented its condition every October with the same quiet precision that Earl brought to everything he recorded. Sandra Pruitt had moved into cabin 14, lot 22, Ridgeline Estates, in 2016, and had become HOA president in 2019 after the previous president moved away. She was organized and energetic in the way that HOA presidents were organized and energetic. She ran the annual meeting, managed the community portal, enforced the covenants, and brought to her role the particular confidence of a person who believed that being HOA president meant having the authority to act on problems she identified as affecting the community. She had identified the bridge as a problem in the spring of 2022. She had driven over it one morning in March and had felt what she described to the board as a vibration, a slight movement in the deck under her tires, the structure's response to load that any bridge engineer would have recognized as normal, elastic behavior within design limits. She had posted about it on the community portal and had received responses from 7 residents who said they had noticed it too. She had called a contractor, not a bridge engineer, a general demolition and excavation contractor named Pete Ferris, whose company did residential foundations and site work, and had asked him to look at the bridge. Pete Ferris had walked across it and had said, "It's old. Those deck planks have some age on them. The steel looks okay, but I'd want to know when it was last inspected." Sandra had taken that as confirmation of her concern. She had not called Earl. She had not looked at the easement. She had not hired a structural engineer. She had called an HOA board meeting, described the bridge as a safety hazard, and proposed having it demolished and replaced with a culvert crossing that she believed would be simpler and cheaper. The board had voted 4-1 in favor of the demolition. The single dissenting vote from a board member named Carl Owens at Lot 7, who had said, "Shouldn't we talk to the property owner first?" Sandra had said, "The bridge is a safety issue. We have the right to act on safety issues affecting the community." Carl had said, "Do we own the bridge?" Sandra had said, "It's on our road." Carl had said, "Is it on our road or on Earl Dunning's property?" Sandra had not answered that question directly. She had moved to a vote. She had called Pete Ferris on Monday and had scheduled the demolition for the following Tuesday morning. She had not called Earl Dunning. Earl had been in his hayfield on that Tuesday morning, the late summer cut, the tractor running, the field visible from the farmhouse, but the creek crossing not visible from the field. He had heard the equipment at 7:40 a.m., the particular sound of an excavator working, the diesel engine and the bucket cycles distinct even at distance. He had stopped the tractor and had listened, and had driven the tractor back to the barn and had walked to the creek crossing on foot. The excavator had been on the bridge. Pete Ferris had been standing on the bank with a clipboard. 2 of the deck planks had already been removed, pulled up by the excavator bucket and stacked on the bank. The steel stringers were exposed. One of the bearing connections had been disturbed by the excavator's positioning, the bolt pattern visible where the bearing plate had been partially dislodged. Earl had stood on his bank and had looked at the bridge for a long moment. The structure he had drawn at his kitchen table in July 1987, the structure he had built over 3 weeks in August and September of that year, the structure he had inspected every October for 35 years, and recorded in a maintenance log that now ran to 4 composition notebooks. He had looked at the excavator on the deck and the removed planks on the bank, and Pete Ferris with his clipboard. He had not spoken to Pete Ferris. He had not asked them to stop. He had taken his phone from his pocket and had photographed the scene, the excavator on the bridge, the removed planks, the disturbed bearing connection, Pete Ferris on the bank, the contractor's truck with the company name visible on the door. He had photographed the time display on his phone against the background of the bridge. He had walked along the bank and photographed the footing conditions on both sides, the stringer exposure, the deck removal progress. He had then walked back to the farmhouse. He had gone to the filing cabinet in his office and had opened the drawer labeled Property Easements and had removed the folder labeled Ridge Road Easement, Book 44, page 178. He had sat at his desk and had opened the folder and had read the easement from page 1 to page 3. Page 3 said what it had always said. He had read the maintenance condition twice. He had looked at the photographs on his phone. He had looked back at the maintenance condition. He had picked up the phone and had called Margaret Yu. Sandra had driven over the bridge on a Wednesday morning in March 2022. The same commute she made every weekday. Ridge Road to the county highway, the creek crossing unremarkable in the 18 years she had been a Ridgeline Estates resident, and the 3 years she had been HOA president. She had felt the deck movement under her tires at the crossing's midpoint, a slight flex, the vehicle rising and settling as the front wheels crossed the center span and the rear wheels followed. She had slowed instinctively and had crossed the rest of the span at 15 miles per hour, and had thought about it for the remainder of the drive to the county highway. She had posted about it on the community portal that evening. The post had read, "Has anyone else noticed that the bridge on Ridge Road seems unstable? I felt significant movement in the deck when I crossed this morning. I'm concerned about safety and think the board should look into it. Please reply if you've experienced the same thing." 7 residents had replied by midnight, each one describing some version of the same experience: the deck movement under the vehicle at the crossing's midpoint, the sensation of the bridge responding to load. One resident, a man named Greg Talbot at Lot 31, had written, "I've noticed it for a while. Felt like the planks were loose. I usually slow down when I cross." Another, Karen Finch at Lot 14, had written, "My husband says it's always done that, but it seems worse lately. Someone should have it checked." Sandra had read the replies and had added them to the evidence in her mind. 7 residents confirming the movement, the suggestion that it had gotten worse. Greg Talbot slowing down on the crossing. She had posted a follow-up. "Thank you, everyone. I'm going to get this looked at. The board takes safety concerns seriously." She had called Pete Ferris the following morning. Pete Ferris ran Ferris Site Solutions, a Harlan County contractor whose primary work was residential foundations, grading, and site preparation, with occasional demolition work when a client needed a structure removed before new construction began. His company had done the grading for 2 of the newer homes at the subdivision's eastern end in 2019, and Sandra had his number in her phone from those projects. She had said, "Pete, Sandra Pruitt from Ridgeline Estates. We have a bridge on our access road that I'm concerned about. Can you come look at it?" Pete had come on a Friday afternoon, driven to the bridge, parked his truck on the Ridge Road shoulder, and walked the structure. He had crossed it twice on foot, had knelt on the deck to look at the plank surface, had stood on the bank and looked at the steel stringers from below, as far as he could see from bank level. He had said, "It's an older structure. Those deck planks have some checking in them. That's normal weathering on treated timber, but it means the surface treatment isn't fully effective anymore. The steel stringers look intact from here, but I can't see the bearing ends without getting under the structure, which I'd need equipment for. When was it last professionally inspected?" Sandra had said, "I don't know. The HOA has been here since 2004, and I've never seen an inspection report." Pete had said, "You'd want to know that. A bridge this age without documented inspection history. I'd want a structural engineer's eyes on it before I gave you a clean bill of health." Sandra had said, "What would you recommend?" Pete had looked at the bridge again. He had said, "If you want my honest opinion as a contractor, structures like this, when there's no inspection history and the residents are feeling movement in the deck, sometimes the cleanest answer is removal and replacement with a proper culvert crossing. A culvert is simpler, no moving parts, no deck planks to maintain, lower long-term cost." Sandra had said, "Could you do that work?" Pete had said, "Demolition and culvert installation, yes. I'd need to get a culvert spec from an engineer for the creek crossing, but the demo work is standard." Sandra had said, "Give me a quote." Pete had sent the quote on Monday. Demolition of the existing timber and steel bridge structure, excavation for culvert installation, culvert supply and installation, grading and road surface restoration. Total, $34,500. Sandra had taken the quote to the board. The board meeting had been on a Tuesday evening. The 5 board members at Sandra's kitchen table, the community portal printout of the bridge complaints in front of each of them, Pete Ferris's quote in the center of the table. Sandra had presented the situation in 12 minutes. The deck movement, the 7 resident complaints, Pete Ferris's assessment, the absence of inspection documentation, the quote for demolition and culvert replacement. She had framed it as a straightforward safety decision. The bridge had an unknown inspection history. Residents were reporting instability. The HOA had a responsibility to the community, and the cleanest resolution was removal and replacement. Carl Owens at Lot 7 had said, "Who owns the bridge?" Sandra had said, "It's on Ridge Road. The HOA maintains the road." Carl had said, "The HOA maintains the road surface within the subdivision. The bridge is at the county highway end of the road, on the property line with Earl Dunning's land. I'm not sure the HOA owns the bridge." Sandra had said, "The bridge is part of the road access. The HOA has authority over road access safety issues." Carl had said, "I think we should look at the easement before we do anything. The road crosses Earl Dunning's property. There's a recorded easement. I'd want to know what it says about the bridge before we hire a contractor." Sandra had said, "Carl, this is a safety issue. We don't need to review a decades-old easement to address a safety issue on our access road." Carl had said, "I'm not saying don't address it. I'm saying read the easement first." Sandra had looked around the table. The other 3 board members had said nothing. The particular silence of people who are not going to disagree with the person running the meeting. Sandra had said, "I'll pull the easement and review it. In the meantime, I'd like a vote on proceeding with the assessment and getting a structural engineer's opinion." Carl had said, "I thought Pete Ferris already assessed it." Sandra had said, "Pete gave a contractor's assessment. I'm proposing we get a structural engineer's opinion." Carl had said, "That seems reasonable." Sandra had not gotten a structural engineer's opinion. She had called Pete Ferris the following morning and had told him they wanted to proceed with the demolition. She had not pulled the easement. She had not called Earl Dunning. The board vote she had conducted at the Tuesday meeting had been on getting a structural engineer's opinion. She had used that vote's outcome, 4-1 in favor of proceeding with assessment, as authorization to proceed with the demolition. Carl Owens, the dissenting vote, had been voting against the structural engineer assessment as unnecessary, given that Pete Ferris had already looked at it. He had not been voting against demolition because demolition had not been on the table when the vote was called. None of that mattered to Sandra. She had a 4-1 vote and a contractor with a quote and a safety concern she had decided required action. She had called Pete on Wednesday morning and had said, "We want to proceed. Can you schedule the demo for next Tuesday?" Pete had said, "I'll need to get the culvert spec finalized. Give me until Thursday." The culvert spec had come from an engineering firm Pete used for drainage work. A 2-page calculation for a 48-inch reinforced concrete culvert at the Tanner Creek crossing, the sizing based on Pete's field measurement of the creek channel. The engineer had not visited the site. The spec had been prepared from Pete's measurements and a county GIS map. Sandra had approved the spec by email on Friday. She had not called Earl Dunning. She had not notified the Harlan County Road Department. She had not obtained a permit for work on a creek crossing, a permit that would have required notification to the property owner and a review of the recorded easement by the county's engineering office. She had sent one communication about the bridge demolition before Tuesday morning. It had been a post on the community portal on Monday evening. The board has arranged for safety work on the Ridge Road bridge crossing. The work will begin tomorrow morning. Ridge Road will be temporarily closed during the work. Please use the alternate county road route until further notice. We expect the work to be completed and access restored within 2 to 3 weeks. Earl Dunning was not on the community portal. He had never been invited to join it. It was the Ridgeline Estates HOA's internal communications platform, accessible to the subdivision's 38 households. Earl's land abutted the subdivision, but Earl was not a Ridgeline Estates resident. Sandra had not sent Earl Dunning a letter. She had not called his phone number, which was listed in the county directory. She had not knocked on his door, which was 600 feet from the bridge on a clear gravel road. She had not sent a certified letter. She had not had her attorney send a notice. She had posted to a community portal that Earl could not access, and had scheduled a contractor to demolish a structure on Earl Dunning's property without telling Earl Dunning. Earl had gone to bed on Monday evening at 10 p.m., the August night warm, the windows open, the hayfield visible in the moonlight from the bedroom. He had set his alarm for 5:30 as he always did in late summer, the early mornings being the best time to run the tractor before the heat built. He had been asleep by 10:15. He had woken at 7:32, not to his alarm, which had gone off at 5:30, and which he had silenced after his morning routine, but to a sound. He had been at the kitchen table with his second cup of coffee when the sound reached the farmhouse, the diesel engine of a piece of heavy equipment, the specific sound of an excavator at work, the engine loading and unloading as the bucket cycled. The sound was coming from the direction of the creek crossing. He had set the coffee cup down and had stood up, and had looked out the kitchen window toward the southwestern corner of the property. He could not see the creek crossing from the farmhouse. The hayfield and a woodlot intervened, but the sound was unmistakable. He had been a civil engineer for 14 years, and had spent those years around heavy equipment. He knew what an excavator sounded like when it was working. He had put on his boots and had walked to the creek crossing. The walk had taken 8 minutes, across the hayfield, through the woodlot gap, down the slope to the creek bank. He had heard the equipment more clearly as he approached, the diesel engine and the bucket cycles, and, underneath them, the sound of wood cracking, the particular crack of structural timber being loaded beyond its fastener pattern, the sound of deck planks being pulled. He had come out of the woodlot onto the creek bank at 7:42. The excavator was positioned on the bridge deck, its tracks spanning 2 of the steel stringers, the bucket arm extended, a deck plank in the bucket's grip. 2 planks had already been removed and were stacked on the far bank. The bucket released the 3rd plank onto the stack, and the arm retracted and repositioned for the 4th. Pete Ferris had been standing on the far bank with a clipboard, his back to Earl, watching the excavator operator work. A pickup truck was parked on the Ridge Road shoulder 50 feet from the bridge. Pete Ferris's truck, the company name Ferris Site Solutions on the door in red lettering, the contractor license number below it. A second vehicle, a flatbed, was parked behind the pickup. Earl had stood on his bank and had looked at the scene. He had looked at it for 30 seconds. The excavator on the deck of the bridge he had built in 1987, the removed planks on the far bank, the steel stringers exposed where the deck had been pulled, the bearing connection on the near stringer already disturbed from the excavator's positioning, the bolt pattern visible where the bearing plate had shifted. He had taken his phone from his pocket. He had photographed the excavator on the bridge from his bank position. The full scene, the excavator, the missing planks, the exposed stringers, the disturbed bearing connection in the foreground. He had photographed Pete Ferris on the far bank, the man with the clipboard, the Ferris Site Solutions truck visible behind him. He had photographed the truck specifically, the company name on the door, the license plate, the contractor license number below the logo. He had photographed his phone's time display, held up against the background of the bridge, 7:44 a.m. He had walked north along his bank to a point where the footing on his side was fully visible, and had photographed the footing condition, the concrete undisturbed, the anchor bolts in place, the bearing plate shifted from the excavator's positioning. He had walked south along the bank and photographed the footing on the downstream side. He had photographed the stringer exposure on both sides, the remaining deck planks, the excavator's track position on the steel. He had made no sound. Pete Ferris had not turned around. The excavator operator had not looked up from his work. Earl had taken 21 photographs in 4 minutes. He had then turned away from the creek and had walked back through the woodlot and across the hayfield to the farmhouse. He had refilled his coffee cup and had sat at the desk in his office. He had opened the bottom left drawer of the filing cabinet, the drawer labeled Property Easements in his handwriting, and had removed the hanging folder labeled Ridge Road Easement, Book 44, page 178. The folder had contained the recorded easement, the title policy from his 2011 acquisition, showing the easement as a listed encumbrance, his 2011 annotation on the copy, and his attorney's letter from before closing, confirming the maintenance condition's legal effect. He had removed the easement and had set it on the desk and had turned to page 3. He had read the maintenance condition. A non-exclusive easement for private road access across the described 340-foot corridor for the benefit of residential lots within the Ridgeline Estates subdivision plat. Said easement conditioned on the easement holder's maintenance of the crossing structure over Tanner Creek at the easement holder's expense and to the satisfaction of the property owner. He had read it twice. He had looked at the photographs on his phone, the excavator on his bridge, the removed planks, the disturbed bearing connection, Pete Ferris on the bank, the time display showing 7:44 a.m. He had looked back at page 3, maintenance of the crossing structure. The HOA had not maintained the crossing structure. The HOA had demolished the crossing structure on his property, without his knowledge, without his authorization, without a phone call, a letter, a knock on his door, or a word of any kind. He had looked at the easement for a long moment, the 3 pages, the maintenance condition, the recording information in the upper right corner of page 1. Book 44, page 178, Harlan County Register of Deeds, recorded October 14, 2003. He had picked up the phone and had called Margaret Yu. Margaret had answered on the second ring. It was 8:15 a.m. on a Tuesday, her office day beginning at 7:30. The call from Earl Dunning's number recognized on her screen from the 2011 acquisition work she had done for him, and the 2 property line questions she had handled in the years since. She had said, "Earl, what's happening?" He had said, "Margaret, I need you to look at the Ridge Road easement. Book 44, page 178, Harlan County Register. I'm going to send you photographs while we talk." She had said, "Give me 2 minutes to pull it." She had the Harlan County deed records on her screen in 90 seconds, the county's online index, the Book 44, page 178 instrument loading as a scanned 3-page document. She had read it while Earl's photographs arrived on her phone in a separate thread. 4, then 8, then 14, then 21 images. The excavator on the bridge, the removed planks, the disturbed bearing connection, the contractor's truck, the time display. She had read page 3 while the last photographs loaded. She had said, "Earl, the photographs, this is happening right now, this morning." He had said, "It started at 7:40. I heard the equipment from the farmhouse. By the time I got to the creek, they had already pulled 3 planks. I photographed everything and came back to the house. They're still working." She had said, "You didn't stop them." He had said, "I documented and came back to the house. I didn't speak to anyone." She had been quiet for 3 seconds. She had said, "That was the right call. Tell me what you know about who authorized this." He had said, "I don't know who authorized it. The truck belongs to Ferris Site Solutions. Pete Ferris, local contractor, does site work and foundations. I photographed the company name and license number on the truck door. I have no communication from the HOA about any work on the crossing. No letter, no phone call, nothing." She had said, "How long have you owned the property?" He had said, "Since March 2011. 11 years. She had said, "In 11 years, has the HOA contacted you about the bridge maintenance? Any maintenance report? Any inspection notice? Any communication at all?" He had said, "Not once. I've noted it in my maintenance log every year since 2015. The log documents my annual inspections going back to 1987, when I built the structure. The HOA has never submitted a maintenance report, never asked about the bridge condition, never communicated with me about the crossing structure in any form." Margaret had been quiet for 2 seconds. She had said, "The maintenance log. You have annual entries from 1987 to present." He had said, 4 composition notebooks, each year dated, each inspection described, each maintenance action recorded with the date and materials used. The October 2021 entry is the most recent. Deck planks sound, stringers clean, connections solid, footings undisturbed, load rating confirmed at 12 tons. She had said, "And the HOA's maintenance record." He had said, 18 years of nothing, documented in the logs as an absence. I started noting it specifically in 2015. Each year's entry closes with an observation that the HOA has made no maintenance contact. She had said, "Earl, I'm going to give you the legal analysis, and then I'm going to tell you what we can do. Are you ready?" He had said, "Go ahead." She had said, "The easement's maintenance condition on page 3 is a material condition of the easement grant. Under Tennessee property law, an easement condition is material when it goes to the fundamental basis of the easement's existence, when the parties clearly intended that the easement would not exist without the condition being performed. The maintenance condition here satisfies that standard. The easement grants road access across private property. The access depends on a crossing structure over a creek. The maintenance of that crossing structure is what makes the access physically possible. Without the structure, the road doesn't cross the creek. The condition is not incidental. It is essential to the easement's function." Earl had said, "I agree with that analysis. I've always understood the maintenance condition as the consideration for the access. They get the road, they maintain the bridge." Margaret had said, "That is precisely the legal character of the condition. The easement is conditioned on maintenance because the maintenance is what Howard Presley required in exchange for granting access across his land. When you acquired the property, you became the party entitled to that maintenance performance. The condition runs to the current property owner, which is you." She had paused. She had said, "The HOA has not maintained the crossing structure. That is the first breach. 18 years of non-performance of the maintenance obligation. The HOA has not conducted inspections, has not submitted maintenance reports, has not performed any documented maintenance on the structure, and has not communicated with you, as the property owner, regarding the structure's condition or upkeep. Earl had said, "Documented in my maintenance log." She had said, "Documented in your maintenance log and provable by the absence of any contrary record in the HOA's files, which we would obtain in discovery if we needed them. The non-performance breach alone is significant, but the photographs you have sent me this morning show something that goes substantially beyond non-performance." She had said, "The HOA did not fail to maintain the crossing structure. The HOA demolished the crossing structure, on your property, without your knowledge or authorization, without any notice to you, without a permit. I checked the Harlan County Building and Land Disturbance permit records while we've been talking, and there is no permit issued for demolition or creek crossing work at this location. The demolition of the crossing structure that the HOA was required to maintain is not a failure to maintain. It is an affirmative act that has destroyed the subject matter of the maintenance obligation, and in doing so, has physically destroyed the access the easement was created to provide." Earl had said, "They demolished the thing they were required to maintain." Margaret had said, "They demolished the thing they were required to maintain on your property without your authorization. Under Tennessee law, the destruction of an easement's enabling structure by the easement holder, particularly when the holder was obligated to maintain that structure as a condition of the easement, constitutes a breach of the easement's material condition. A material breach of an easement condition is grounds for termination of the easement." Earl had said, "I know. I confirmed that with you before I closed on the property in 2011. She had said, "I know you did. I'm restating it now because the legal position is exactly what we discussed then. The HOA's demolition of the crossing structure is the event that triggers the termination right. The prior non-performance of the maintenance obligation is corroborating evidence of the HOA's pattern of breach, but this morning's demolition is the material breach that gives us the legal basis to act." Earl had said, "What is the process?" She had said, "We document the breach formally, provide written notice to the HOA, and close the road." She had driven to the property on Thursday, 2 days after the demolition, the work completed by Tuesday afternoon, the bridge gone, and the creek crossing reduced to the exposed limestone creek bed between the two cut banks where the footings had been. Pete Ferris had removed everything: the deck planks, the steel stringers, the bearing plates, the anchor bolts. He had left the concrete footings in place on both banks, their tops cut flush with the bank surface, the anchor bolt holes visible in the footing faces. Margaret had photographed the creek crossing in full: the absent bridge, the footing remnants, the cut banks, the creek bed below. She had photographed the road on Earl's side of the crossing, the gravel surface running from the county highway to the cut bank, the road ending at the creek edge with no crossing structure. She had photographed the road on the HOA side, the gravel surface starting at the far cut bank and running into the subdivision. The two road segments, 340 feet on Earl's land and the subdivision's internal network, now separated by 22 feet of creek with no means of crossing. She had walked the easement corridor, the full 340 feet from the county highway to the crossing, the road surface intact, the corridor exactly as described in the easement's legal description. The road was there. The access it was supposed to provide was physically impossible without a crossing structure. She had then walked to the farmhouse with Earl and had sat at his desk and had reviewed the maintenance log. All 4 composition notebooks, from the first entry in September 1987 to the October 2021 entry. She had read the 2015 through 2021 entries with particular attention, noting the year-end observations about the HOA's absence of maintenance contact. She had said, "The log is exactly what I hoped it would be. 35 years of dated entries, each one describing the inspection findings and any maintenance actions taken. Your handwriting is consistent throughout. The notebooks are worn in the way that a working document is worn, not in the way that a document created after the fact to support a legal position is worn. This log is going to be central to the record." Earl had said, "I started it the day I completed the bridge, every October since." She had said, and the HOA has produced nothing comparable in 18 years of easement operation. He had said, "As far as I know, they have produced nothing at all related to this bridge." She had said, "We're going to find out. When this reaches the negotiating table or a courtroom, the HOA's maintenance records will be subpoenaed. My expectation is that those records will show exactly what your log suggests, that the HOA never treated the maintenance condition as an obligation it needed to perform." She had looked at the easement copy on Earl's desk, the 3 pages, page 3 with the maintenance condition. She had said, "I want to walk through the termination notice requirements under Tennessee law. The easement does not specify a cure period for breach. It was drafted without an explicit termination procedure, which is common in private easements from this period. In the absence of a specified procedure, Tennessee courts apply a reasonable notice standard. The easement holder must receive reasonable written notice of the breach and a reasonable opportunity to cure before the property owner acts on the termination right." Earl had said, "What is reasonable?" She had said, "Courts have found 30 days reasonable for most easement breaches. The cure for this breach, rebuilding the crossing structure to the property owner's satisfaction, is a significant construction project that cannot be completed in 30 days. The cure period gives the HOA the opportunity to respond, but effectively cannot be satisfied in the time provided, which means the termination right matures at the end of the period. We send a 30-day notice. The HOA cannot cure in 30 days, and at the end of 30 days, we have the documented right to close the road." Earl had said, "And closing the road, the mechanism." She had said, "You install a physical barrier across the road on your property. The 340-foot easement corridor is on your land. If the easement is terminated by the HOA's material breach, you are entitled to close the road. The gate goes on your land, on the road that is yours, on the corridor that reverts to your exclusive use when the easement terminates." Earl had said, "What happens to Ridge Road in the meantime, between the notice and the termination date?" She had said, "The easement is still in force during the cure period. The HOA has the right to use the road during the 30 days, but the bridge is gone. They can't cross the creek. The road is physically impassable at the crossing regardless of the easement status. The cure period and the physical reality of the creek are the same problem from different angles." Earl had said, "The road closes itself when they demolish the bridge." Margaret had said, "It closes itself physically the moment they pulled the last stringer. What we are doing with the formal notice and the termination process is closing it legally, establishing the documented record that will support every subsequent action we take." Earl had said, "Write the notice." She had sent it on Friday morning, certified mail to the Lakeview. She had sent it Friday morning to the Ridgeline Estates HOA's registered agent address, the registered agent being Sandra Pruitt as HOA president, the address the subdivision's management office on Lot 1. The notice had been 4 pages, the easement identified by recording reference, the maintenance condition quoted in full, the breach described in 2 categories. The first category was the 18-year non-performance of the maintenance obligation, Earl's annual inspection log cited by date range, the absence of any HOA maintenance record, communication or contact regarding the crossing structure, documented as a pattern of non-performance spanning the full period of Earl's ownership. The second category was the demolition, the August 2022 demolition of the crossing structure by a contractor hired by the HOA, conducted on Earl Dunning's property without his knowledge or authorization, without a required county permit, and without any notice to the property owner. The demolition had been described in factual terms: the date, the contractor, the photographs attached as exhibits, the footing remnants visible in the post-demolition photographs. The notice had then stated the legal conclusion: the HOA had breached the material condition of the recorded easement by destroying the crossing structure it was obligated to maintain. The breach was material because the maintenance of the crossing structure was the essential condition on which the easement had been granted. The breach entitled the property owner to terminate the easement. The cure: the HOA had 30 days from receipt of the notice to reconstruct the crossing structure over Tanner Creek to a condition satisfactory to the property owner. The reconstructed structure was required to meet the load rating and structural specifications of the original structure, as documented in Earl Dunning's construction records and maintenance log, and was required to be certified by a licensed structural engineer before Earl Dunning would assess it for satisfaction. The consequence of non-cure. At the expiration of the 30-day cure period, if the crossing structure had not been reconstructed to the property owner's satisfaction, Earl Dunning would exercise his right to terminate the easement and close the road corridor. The notice had closed with a single sentence that Margaret had written in plain language, rather than the formal register of the preceding pages. Mr. Dunning has maintained this crossing structure at his own expense for 35 years, in the absence of any performance by the easement holders. He did not build this structure so that others could destroy it without consequence. Earl had read the notice before Margaret sent it. He had said, the last sentence. Margaret had said, it stays in. It is accurate, and the HOA's attorney needs to read it before they advise their client on a response. Earl had said, send it. She had sent it Friday morning by certified mail. Sandra Pruitt had signed the delivery receipt the following Monday at 9:17 a.m. The 30-day clock had started Monday. The bridge was gone. The creek crossing was impassable. The clock was running. And Earl Dunning had 35 years of maintenance logs, 21 photographs taken at 7:44 a.m. on a Tuesday morning, and a page 3 maintenance condition that said exactly what it said. The 30 days had run without a response from the HOA that constituted a cure. Sandra had called Margaret's office on the 3rd day after the notice arrived, a Wednesday, the call going to Margaret's assistant, Sandra identifying herself as the Ridgeline Estates HOA president and asking to speak with Margaret Yu about the notice her client had sent. Margaret had called back that afternoon and had listened to Sandra for 4 minutes before she spoke. Sandra had said, "The board made a safety decision about the bridge. We had resident complaints about structural instability. We hired a contractor to address the safety concern. We had no idea Mr. Dunning had any claim on the bridge structure. The bridge is on the access road, and the access road serves our community." Margaret had said, "Ms. Pruitt, the bridge was on Mr. Dunning's property. The easement that gives your community access to Ridge Road contains a condition on page 3 requiring the HOA to maintain the crossing structure. The HOA demolished the crossing structure without Mr. Dunning's knowledge or authorization. The notice sets out the legal position and the cure requirement. If the HOA intends to cure the breach by reconstructing the crossing structure within 30 days, Mr. Dunning will assess the reconstructed structure for satisfaction. If the HOA does not cure, Mr. Dunning will exercise his termination right." Sandra had said, "We're not going to rebuild a bridge in 30 days. Margaret had said, "The notice states the cure requirement. The timeline runs from the date of receipt." Sandra had said, "This is completely unreasonable." Margaret had said, "The notice reflects Mr. Dunning's legal position. I'd recommend the HOA retain counsel to review it." She had ended the call. Sandra had not retained counsel in the first week. She had posted a message to the community portal on Thursday, 2 days after the certified notice arrived, 1 day after her call with Margaret, a message that described the situation in terms that minimized the legal dimension and maximized the safety narrative. The board is aware that Earl Dunning has sent a letter claiming rights over the bridge we recently replaced for safety reasons. We are reviewing the matter and will update the community. Please continue using the alternate route. The alternate route was the county road loop around the valley's northern end, 22 minutes each direction, the loop adding 44 minutes to a round-trip commute for every Ridgeline Estates resident who used Ridge Road to reach the county highway. The community portal had begun filling with questions the day Pete Ferris finished the demolition, and the road closed itself physically at the creek crossing. By the time Margaret's notice arrived, it had 60 posts. By the end of the first week, it had 140. The dominant question in the thread had been the same question in different forms. When does the road reopen? Sandra's answer to that question had evolved over the first 2 weeks from, "We're working on it," to, "There are some legal questions to resolve," to silence. The silence of a person who has read a certified legal notice, understands that she cannot answer the question, and has not yet found an attorney who can give her a better answer than the one the notice implied. She had retained Cliff Basham in the second week, a Harlan County real estate attorney who had handled the HOA's developer warranty claims in 2007, and whose name Sandra had in the HOA's files from that proceeding. Cliff had requested the easement, the notice, and any HOA records related to the bridge decision. Sandra had sent him the easement, the notice, and the board meeting minutes from the Tuesday evening vote. Cliff had called Sandra at the end of the second week, day 16 of the 30-day cure period. That call would come later. First, the 30 days had to run. On day 31, the morning after the cure period expired without any reconstruction of the crossing structure or any written communication from the HOA constituting a cure, Earl had driven his truck to the county highway end of Ridge Road and had parked on the shoulder. He had unloaded the gate from the truck bed, a steel tube farm gate, 14 feet wide, the same gate pattern he used on his field entrances, galvanized finish, the hinges welded to a 4-inch square steel post he had set in concrete the previous weekend at the road's edge. He had installed the post on a Sunday, the day before the cure period expired, working in the early morning before the heat built, the post hole dug with the tractor auger, the post set plumb in the concrete and braced while it cured. He had checked the concrete cure on Monday evening and had found it solid. Tuesday morning, he had hung the gate. The gate had swung true on the hinges, level, the latch bar meeting the receiver post cleanly, the swing arc clearing the road surface. He had closed it, latched it, and run the chain through the latch and the gate frame and through the loop on the receiver post and had put the padlock through the chain. He had clicked the padlock closed. He had stepped back and had looked at the gate across Ridge Road, the galvanized steel, the padlock, the road visible behind it running toward the absent creek crossing and the subdivision beyond. He had photographed it from the county highway side, the gate closed, the padlock visible, the no trespassing signs he had affixed to the gate's top rail at 3-foot intervals. He had photographed it from the roadside, the gate from the subdivision perspective, the county highway visible beyond it. He had photographed the padlock close up, the latch engagement, the post installation. He had noted the time on his phone, 7:51 a.m. He had then driven to the HOA's management office on Lot 1, Sandra Pruitt's address, the registered agent address on the notice, and had delivered a written closure notice in a sealed envelope, knocking on the door and handing it to the woman who answered, identifying himself as Earl Dunning, and asking that it be provided to Sandra Pruitt immediately. The woman had taken the envelope. Earl had photographed the delivery, the envelope in the woman's hand, the management office door behind her, the time display. He had returned to the farmhouse. The closure notice had been one page, the easement identified, the cure period stated as having expired without cure, the termination right exercised as of the date of the notice, the road corridor on parcel 44-002-0018, closed to all use effective immediately. Margaret had drafted it. Earl had signed it. He had been back at the farmhouse by 9 a.m. Sandra had received the closure notice at 9:15. She had called the Harlan County Sheriff's Office at 9:22. Deputy Roy Hatch had arrived at the gate at 10:07, a man in his mid-40s, the department's senior property deputy, the one dispatched to calls involving land disputes because he had 17 years of experience with the particular category of situation where someone believed a property matter was a law enforcement matter and needed to understand the difference. Sandra had been at the gate when Roy arrived. She had driven to the county highway end of Ridge Road after calling the sheriff's office and had been standing on the road shoulder looking at the padlocked gate for 45 minutes before Roy's cruiser pulled in behind her car. She had said, "Deputy, this man has closed our road. He has no right to do this. Our community of 38 families cannot access the county highway. I need this gate removed." Roy had looked at the gate. He had said, "Whose land is this?" Sandra had said, "The road is our access road. It has always been our access road." Roy had said, "Whose land is the road on? Is this inside your subdivision?" Sandra had said, The road crosses a section of his property before it reaches our entrance, but we have an easement." Roy had said, "You have a recorded easement for this road." Sandra had said, "Yes." Roy had said, "Do you have a copy of it?" Sandra had said, "Not with me." Roy had said, "I'd like to look at it before I do anything else. Can you get it to me?" Sandra had called Cliff Basham from the road shoulder and had asked him to email the easement to her phone. It had arrived in 4 minutes. She had handed her phone to Roy. Roy had read the easement on Sandra's phone screen, the 3 pages, the standard access language on pages 1 and 2, and page 3. He had read page 3 twice. He had said, "Ms. Pruitt, the easement on page 3 has a condition. It says the HOA maintains the crossing structure over Tanner Creek." Sandra had said, "The bridge was a safety hazard. The board voted to address the safety concern." Roy had said, "Where is the bridge now?" Sandra had said, "We had it removed. We were going to replace it with a culvert." Roy had said, "You removed the crossing structure that your easement requires you to maintain." Sandra had looked at Roy for a moment. She had said, "We were replacing it with something better." Roy had said, "Does the easement say you can replace it with something the property owner hasn't approved?" Sandra had said nothing. Roy had said, "The easement says the crossing structure is maintained to the satisfaction of the property owner. Mr. Dunning is the property owner. Did the board contact Mr. Dunning before removing the bridge?" Sandra had said, "We posted to the community portal." Roy had said, "Did you contact Mr. Dunning directly? Letter, phone call, anything?" Sandra had said nothing. Roy had said, "Ms. Pruitt, the road is on private property. The man who owns the property has a legal document showing his right to close it. That document is a recorded easement with a maintenance condition that the HOA was required to perform. You've told me the HOA removed the crossing structure. The easement required it to maintain. That is a legal dispute between the HOA and the property owner, and it is not something I can resolve by removing a gate from a private road on private property." Sandra had said, "Our 38 families cannot get to the county highway." Roy had said, "I understand that is a serious hardship. It is a civil matter between the HOA and Mr. Dunning. If the HOA believes Mr. Dunning's closure is unlawful, the remedy is a court filing. Your attorney can seek an injunction. I cannot remove a gate from a private road based on a disputed easement. That is not a law enforcement matter." Sandra had said, "He is blocking 38 families from their homes." Roy had said, "He is closing a private road on his private property. Whether he has the right to do that, given the easement's history, is a question for a judge, not a sheriff's deputy. Ma'am, there is nothing I can do here." He had handed Sandra's phone back to her, and had returned to his cruiser and had driven away. Sandra had stood at the gate for a long moment. The padlocked steel, the no trespassing signs, Ridge Road visible behind it running toward the absent creek crossing, and the subdivision beyond. The alternate route was 22 minutes each direction. Her 38 families had been using it for 31 days since the bridge came down, and would continue using it until this was resolved. She had called an emergency HOA meeting for that evening. The meeting had been in the Ridgeline Estates community room, the common area building at Lot 1, folding chairs set up for the 38 households, 26 residents present when Sandra called the meeting to order at 7 p.m. Cliff Basham had been at the table beside her. Sandra had opened by describing the gate closure, the sheriff's response, and the closure notice. She had characterized the situation as Earl Dunning's aggressive overreach in response to a safety action the board had taken in the community's interest. She had said, "We made a decision to protect our residents from an unsafe bridge. Mr. Dunning is using that decision to try to take away our road access. The board is not going to let that happen." Carl Owens had said, "Sandra, I asked at the board meeting whether we owned the bridge. You said the bridge was part of our road. Did you read the easement before you hired the contractor?" Sandra had said, "The board made a safety decision." Carl had said, "Did you read the easement?" Sandra had said, "I reviewed the relevant documents." Carl had said, "The easement has a maintenance condition on page 3. I know because I read it last week. Did you read it before the board voted?" The room had been quiet. Sandra had said, "Cliff, can you explain the legal situation to the community?" Cliff had looked at the room. He had looked at his notes. He had said, "I've reviewed the easement, Mr. Dunning's termination notice, and the board meeting minutes from August. I want to give you my honest assessment." He had said, "The easement contains a maintenance condition on page 3. The condition requires the HOA to maintain the crossing structure over Tanner Creek at the HOA's expense and to the satisfaction of the property owner. This is a condition of the easement, not a separate obligation, but a condition on which the easement itself was granted. The easement exists because Howard Presley agreed to grant road access in exchange for the HOA maintaining the crossing structure." He had said, "The HOA has not performed the maintenance condition in 18 years. I have reviewed the HOA's records, and there is no documentation of any maintenance performed on the crossing structure, no inspection reports, no communication with Mr. Dunning about the bridge's condition, and no record of any action taken to satisfy the maintenance obligation at any point since the easement was recorded in 2003. He had paused. He had said, "In August of this year, the HOA hired a contractor to demolish the crossing structure. The demolition was conducted on Mr. Dunning's property without his knowledge or authorization, and without a required county permit. The crossing structure that the HOA was required to maintain was removed by the HOA's own contractor." The room had been very quiet. He had said, "Under Tennessee property law, a condition is material to an easement when the easement would not have been granted without it. This maintenance condition is material. The easement was specifically negotiated to include this condition at the prior property owner's insistence. The HOA's demolition of the structure it was required to maintain constitutes a breach of the easement's material condition. Mr. Dunning's notice is legally grounded. He has grounds to terminate." A resident named Frank Gallo at Lot 19 had said, "Can he actually close the road permanently?" Cliff had said, "If the easement is terminated by material breach, the road reverts to the property owner's exclusive use. The gate would be permanent unless the parties negotiate a new easement." Frank had said, "How do we get a new easement?" Cliff had said, "We negotiate with Mr. Dunning from the position we are in, which is the position of the party that breached the material condition of the existing easement. That is not a strong negotiating position." Sandra had said, "Find a way to challenge his termination." Cliff had looked at his notes again. He had said, "I've looked at the challenge arguments, the safety necessity defense, the argument that the HOA acted under a safety necessity that justified altering the crossing structure, has a significant problem. The HOA did not consult a licensed structural engineer before demolishing the bridge. Pete Ferris is a site contractor. His assessment was not an engineering determination. Mr. Dunning's maintenance log documents the bridge as load-rated and structurally sound as of October 2021, 10 months before the demolition. A safety necessity defense requires an actual safety determination, not a contractor's opinion that the structure was old." Sandra had said, "Pete Ferris said it was unsafe." Cliff had said, "Pete Ferris said it was old and had no documented inspection history." Mr. Dunning has 35 years of documented inspection history. The log runs from 1987 to October 2021. Every annual entry confirms the structure's condition. The safety necessity argument is not viable against that record. Sandra had said, "There has to be another argument." Cliff had said, "The waiver argument, that Mr. Dunning waived his right to enforce the maintenance condition by not objecting to the HOA's non-performance for 18 years, is the only remaining theory. But waiver of a property right requires affirmative evidence that the right holder intended to relinquish the right. The absence of enforcement is not waiver if the property owner was documenting the breach annually and maintaining the structure himself." Mr. Dunning's maintenance log entries from 2015 onward specifically note the HOA's non-performance. He was documenting the breach, not waiving it. The room had been quiet for a long moment. Carl Owens had said, "So we go to the negotiating table." Cliff had said, "That is the path to restoring access. Mr. Dunning holds the legal position, and he holds the gate. The negotiation will be conducted from that reality." Sandra had said, "I'm not going to negotiate from a position of admitted breach." Carl had said, "Sandra, you hired a contractor to demolish a bridge on a man's property without reading the easement that governs our access to this road. You didn't tell him it was happening. You didn't get a permit. You didn't hire an engineer. The breach is not a negotiating position. It is what happened." Cliff is telling us that the only way back to this road is through Earl Dunning's willingness to negotiate. I think we should be grateful that he hasn't filed a lawsuit yet and get to the table before he does. The room had been quiet. Sandra had looked at Cliff. Cliff had looked at his notes. Frank Gallo had looked at the ceiling. Carl Owens had looked at Sandra. The gate was padlocked. The creek crossing was a limestone creek bed between two cut banks. The alternate route was 22 minutes each direction. The maintenance log ran from 1987 to 2021 in 4 composition notebooks in Earl Dunning's filing cabinet. The road home was through the negotiating table. Sandra had said nothing further that evening, but she had not said yes to the table either. That would take 3 more weeks and 1 phone call from Carl Owens to Cliff Basham, made without Sandra's knowledge on a Thursday morning, when Carl had decided that waiting for Sandra to accept the reality of their position was costing 38 families 44 minutes a day that they did not have to spend. The alternate route had been manageable for the first 3 days, the kind of inconvenience that residents absorb when they believe it is temporary. The county road loop around the valley's northern end, adding 22 minutes to the morning commute and 22 minutes to the evening return. The detour marked in everyone's mental map as a problem being addressed. By the end of the first week, it had stopped being manageable. Frank Gallo at Lot 19 had a 7 a.m. shift at the regional hospital in the county seat, a shift he reached in 23 minutes via Ridge Road, and now reached in 45 minutes via the alternate route, requiring him to leave at 6:15 instead of 6:42. His wife drove their 2 children to school at 7:30, a trip that had added 11 minutes each way, the school pickup time now requiring her to leave work 4 minutes early to avoid the late pickup penalty. Frank had posted to the community portal on day 4. "I'm now leaving for work 28 minutes earlier than I did 2 weeks ago. When does this get fixed?" Karen Finch at Lot 14 had posted on day 5. "My mother is 79 and lives with us. Her cardiologist is in town. We used to be 18 minutes from his office via Ridge Road. We are now 41 minutes. For a woman with her condition, that extra 23 minutes in an emergency is not a small thing. I need to know what the board's plan is, and I need to know now." A retired school teacher named Dorothy Marsh at Lot 4 had posted on day 6. "I have lived in this subdivision since 2006. I have crossed that bridge every day for 16 years. I was told the board was replacing it with something better. I am now learning that the man who owns the land the bridge was on has locked our road. Can someone explain to me how the board decided to demolish a bridge on someone else's property without asking that person first?" The portal thread had reached 200 posts by the end of the second week, the entries shifting from questions about the road reopening to questions about the board's decision-making process, the shift driven by 2 things: Dorothy Marsh's question, which had 31 replies, and which had framed the core issue in plain language that everyone understood, and a post from Carl Owens on day 9. Carl had written, "I want the community to know that at the August board meeting, I asked whether the HOA owned the bridge, and whether we should read the easement before proceeding. I was told the bridge was part of our road, and that the board had authority to act on safety concerns. I voted against the motion. I'm asking Sandra to share the easement with the community so everyone can read page 3. Sandra had replied, "Carl, the board made a safety decision in good faith. The bridge had no inspection history, and residents were reporting instability. The board acted to protect the community." Carl had replied, "Sandra, I asked if we own the bridge. The answer to that question matters. Please share the easement." Sandra had not shared the easement. Greg Talbot at Lot 31 had found it himself. The Harlan County Deed Index was publicly accessible online, and Greg, who worked as a title processor for a mortgage company in the county seat, had pulled Book 44, page 178 on day 11, and had posted it to the portal thread with a comment. "I pulled the easement from the county's records. Page 3 has a maintenance condition. The HOA was required to maintain the bridge at the HOA's expense and to the property owner's satisfaction. I don't see any record of the HOA ever doing that. I also don't see where the HOA notified the property owner before demolishing the structure." The post had received 44 replies in 24 hours. Dorothy Marsh had replied, "So we demolished a bridge we were supposed to maintain, on land we don't own, without telling the owner. Is that what happened?" Greg had replied, "That appears to be what happened." Frank Gallo had replied, "Who authorized this?" Sandra had called an emergency board meeting on day 13. The 5 board members, Cliff Basham dialing in by phone. She had presented the situation as a legal misunderstanding that Cliff was working to resolve. The terminology of misunderstanding chosen to suggest a bilateral confusion rather than a unilateral error. Cliff had corrected the framing within 2 minutes of joining the call. He had said, "Sandra, I want to be direct with the board about the legal position so everyone understands what we're working with." He had said, "The easement's maintenance condition is material. The HOA's demolition of the structure it was required to maintain is a breach of that condition. Mr. Dunning's attorney has sent a formal notice documenting the breach and requiring cure within 30 days. The cure requires reconstruction of the crossing structure to Mr. Dunning's satisfaction. The notice is legally grounded, and Mr. Dunning has a viable termination claim if the breach is not cured. Board member Patricia Vance at Lot 8 had said, "Can we cure it? Can we rebuild the bridge in 30 days?" Cliff had said, "The cure requires an engineered structure certified by a licensed structural engineer and accepted by Mr. Dunning as satisfying the maintenance condition. The design, permitting, fabrication, and construction timeline for a load-rated bridge structure over a creek crossing is not a 30-day project under any realistic construction schedule. The cure period cannot be satisfied in the time provided." Sandra had said, "So the notice is designed to expire." Cliff had said, "The notice is designed to establish the documented record of breach and non-cure that supports the termination right. 30 days is the legally required reasonable notice period. It is not designed to be satisfiable. It is designed to be reasonable, and courts have consistently found 30 days reasonable for easement breach notices. The fact that the cure cannot be completed in 30 days is a consequence of the scope of the breach, not a design feature of the notice." Sandra had said, "We need to challenge the notice." Cliff had said, "I've been through the challenge arguments in detail. The safety necessity defense fails because the board did not retain a licensed structural engineer before proceeding. The contractor's assessment is not a professional engineering determination, and Mr. Dunning has 35 years of documented inspection history showing the structure was sound. The waiver argument fails because Mr. Dunning was documenting the HOA's non-performance annually in his maintenance log while maintaining the structure himself. The lack of notice argument, that Mr. Dunning should have notified the HOA of his intent before closing the road, is procedurally backwards. It was the HOA that was required to notify the property owner before demolishing a structure on his land, and it did not. He had paused. He had said, "The only path to restored road access is a negotiated new easement with Mr. Dunning. That negotiation will proceed from the HOA's position as the party that breached the existing easement's material condition. That is not a favorable starting position, but it is the position we are in." Sandra had said, "I will not go to that man and admit we were wrong." Carl Owens had said, Sandra had said, "The board made a safety decision. We are not going to validate his claim by going to the table as the party at fault." Cliff had said, "Ms. Pruitt, the alternative to the table is a superior court proceeding in which Mr. Dunning files a quiet title action establishing the easement's termination by material breach, seeks a declaration that the road corridor has reverted to his exclusive use, and potentially adds a trespass claim for the unauthorized demolition of his crossing structure on his property. That proceeding will take 12 to 18 months. The alternate route will be the community's access for that entire period. And at the end of that proceeding, based on the record as I understand it, the HOA's likelihood of prevailing is low." The board had been quiet. Carl had said, "We go to the table." Sandra had said, "This meeting is adjourned." Margaret's formal easement termination notice had arrived at Sandra's registered address on the same Monday that Earl had installed the gate. The two actions coordinated in timing, the gate closure and the formal notice reaching Sandra simultaneously, so that the physical reality of the closed road and the legal document explaining why it was closed arrived together. Sandra had read the notice at her desk on Monday morning, with the gate padlocked at the county highway end of Ridge Road, and the community portal at 247 posts, and her phone receiving calls from 4 residents she had not returned. The notice had been 4 pages, the breach documented in 2 categories. The cure requirement stated, the 30-day clock running from receipt. Margaret's closing sentence had been the one Sandra had read 3 times. Mr. Dunning has maintained this crossing structure at his own expense for 35 years, in the absence of any performance by the easement holders. He did not build this structure so that others could destroy it without consequence. Sandra had set the notice on her desk and had looked at it. She had then done what she had been doing for 3 weeks. She had posted to the community portal. The post had read, "The board has received a formal notice from Mr. Dunning's attorney. We are reviewing it with our legal counsel and will provide an update at the end of the week. The board continues to stand behind the safety decision it made and is pursuing all available legal options." Greg Talbot had replied within the hour. "Sandra, the notice is about the maintenance condition on page 3 of the easement. The HOA was required to maintain the bridge. We demolished it instead. What legal options address that fact? Sandra had not replied to Greg Talbot. Dorothy Marsh had replied, I have been in this community for 16 years. I trusted the board to manage our common interests competently. I am asking directly, did anyone on the board read the easement before voting to demolish the bridge? Yes or no? Sandra had not replied to Dorothy Marsh. Carl Owens had replied, Dorothy, the answer is no. The 30 days had run. No reconstruction had begun. No engineer had been hired. No communication from the HOA to Earl constituting a cure offer had been made. Sandra had directed Cliff to draft a challenge letter disputing the termination notice's legal basis, and Cliff had drafted it and had sent Sandra a cover note with it that read, I want to be clear that this letter preserves our position for the record, but does not constitute a legal defense that will prevail in court. The maintenance condition breach is documented. The challenge letter buys time, but not a different outcome. Sandra had sent the challenge letter anyway. It had gone to Margaret on day 22, 8 days before the cure period expired. Margaret had read it, noted that it raised no legal argument she had not already addressed in the termination notice, and had filed it in the case folder without responding. On day 31, Earl had installed the gate. On day 31, Sandra had called the sheriff. On day 31, Deputy Roy Hatch had read page 3 of the easement on Sandra's phone screen and had said, Ma'am, there is nothing I can do here. The portal had reached 310 posts by the evening of day 31. The gate closure generating the same concentrated burst of community response that the bridge demolition had generated 5 weeks earlier, but angrier, because the community now understood what had happened, and why, and who had made the decision that had made it happen. Frank Gallo had posted, We have been on the alternate route for 31 days. My family has lost approximately 23 hours of time to the additional commute. The bridge that served this community for 35 years was demolished by our board without reading the easement that governed our access to this road. I would like Sandra Pruitt to resign. The post had received 19 likes. Dorothy Marsh had posted, I second Frank's request. That post had received 22 likes. Carl Owens had posted, The board needs to get to the negotiating table with Mr. Dunning. That is the only way this road reopens. I am asking Sandra to authorize Cliff Basham to contact Mr. Dunning's attorney and request a meeting. Sandra had not responded to Carl's post. Carl had called Cliff Basham on Thursday morning, day 34, 3 days after the gate went up, without Sandra's authorization. He had said, Cliff, I'm a board member. I'm asking you to contact Margaret Yu and request a negotiating session. I don't have the board president's authorization, but I have the authority as a board member to request that we pursue the only viable path to restoring access. Will you make the call? Cliff had said, I'll make the call, but Sandra is going to find out. Carl had said, I know, make the call. Cliff had called Margaret at 10 a.m. Thursday. Margaret had called Earl at 10:15. Earl had said, set the date. The gate was still padlocked. The creek was still a limestone bed between two cut banks. The alternate route was still 44 minutes round trip for 38 families. But the call had been made. The table was set. Sandra Pruitt would find out on Friday morning when Cliff sent her the meeting confirmation. She would call Carl and tell him he had no authority to direct legal counsel without the board president's approval. Carl would say, Sandra, I have the authority as a board member to pursue the community's interests when the board president's inaction is causing ongoing harm to 38 families. You can call a board vote to censure me after the road reopens. Right now, I'm going to the meeting. Sandra would attend the meeting. She would not speak first, but she would attend. The meeting had been on a Tuesday morning, Margaret's conference room in Knoxville, the 2-hour drive from Harlan County. Earl and Margaret on one side of the table, Cliff and Sandra and Carl Owens on the other. Sandra had arrived last, 3 minutes after the scheduled start, and had taken the chair at the end of the HOA's side without acknowledging Earl directly. Earl had nodded at Carl. Carl had nodded back. They had met once, briefly, at the gate on the morning Sandra called the sheriff. Carl, having driven to the county highway end of Ridge Road after the meeting broke up, and having stood at the gate for a few minutes before driving away without speaking to anyone. Earl had seen him from the farmhouse. He had understood what the man was doing, taking his own measure of the situation, which was a thing Earl respected. Margaret had opened the session. She had said, the parties are here to discuss terms for a new easement for Ridge Road access, across parcel 44-002-0018. Mr. Dunning's position is that the existing easement was terminated by the HOA's material breach of the maintenance condition. The HOA's position on that legal question is noted for the record. The purpose of this meeting is to determine whether the parties can reach a negotiated resolution that restores road access and establishes a durable easement going forward. Mr. Dunning has 4 terms. I'll present them in order. She had placed a 1-page term sheet in the center of the table. She had said, Term 1. The HOA executes and records an acknowledgement instrument confirming that the demolition of the crossing structure in August 2022 constituted a breach of the maintenance condition in the recorded easement at Book 44, page 178, Harlan County Register of Deeds. The acknowledgement is recorded against the HOA's common area parcel and against each of the 38 individual residential lots. It is a public instrument in the county's deed records. Sandra had said, "We are not going to record an admission of liability." Margaret had said, "It is an acknowledgement of breach, not an admission of liability for damages beyond what the settlement provides. The distinction is legally significant. The acknowledgement establishes the record that the prior easement was terminated by breach and that the new easement is a fresh grant made in settlement of the breach claim. Without the acknowledgement, the new easement has no recorded basis for its existence separate from the terminated one. The acknowledgement is not optional." Cliff had looked at Sandra. He had given a small nod. Sandra had said nothing further on Term 1. Margaret had said, Term 2. The HOA funds the complete design and construction of a new engineered crossing structure over Tanner Creek at the Ridge Road location. The structure is designed by a licensed structural engineer, selected from a list of 3 engineers Mr. Dunning will provide. The design is submitted to Mr. Dunning for review before permitting. The structure is built to a minimum 15-ton load rating. Construction is completed within 180 days of the new easement's recording. The engineer provides a signed certification of completion and load rating before Mr. Dunning opens the gate. Cliff had said, the HOA's estimated cost for an engineered bridge at this crossing is between $85,000 and $110,000, based on preliminary numbers Pete Ferris provided. Margaret had said, Mr. Dunning's structural engineer has estimated $95,000 to $115,000 for a properly specified steel and concrete structure at this span. The HOA bears the full cost. The contractor is selected by the HOA from a list of qualified bridge contractors Mr. Dunning will approve. Pete Ferris is not on the list. Sandra had said, Pete Ferris did the original assessment. Margaret had said, Pete Ferris demolished a sound bridge structure on Mr. Dunning's property without a permit and without the property owner's knowledge. He is not going to build the replacement. Sandra had said, nothing further on Term 2. Margaret had said, Term 3. The HOA pays Mr. Dunning $28,500 as compensation for the demolition of the 1987 crossing structure. The figure represents the depreciated replacement value of the structure, as assessed by a licensed appraiser. The original construction cost documented in Mr. Dunning's 1987 project records, depreciated over 35 years at standard infrastructure depreciation rates, producing a current value of $28,500 for the structural materials and construction labor that the HOA's contractor removed and disposed of without authorization. Sandra had said, $28,500 for a 35-year-old wooden bridge. Margaret had said, a 35-year-old steel and treated timber bridge that was load rated at 12 tons and documented as structurally sound in an annual inspection log 10 months before the HOA demolished it. The appraisal methodology is standard infrastructure depreciation. The figure is what it is. Sandra had said, we'll pay $12,000. The table had been quiet. Earl had said, his first words of the meeting, the figure is $28,500. It does not move. Sandra had looked at Earl. Earl had looked at Sandra with the particular patience of a man who had been waiting for this moment since 7:44 a.m. on a Tuesday morning in August, when he had stood on the creek bank and watched an excavator pull the deck planks off a bridge he had built with his own drawings and his own hands 35 years earlier. Sandra had said, that is an unreasonable figure for a depreciated structure. Earl had said, the structure was sound, it was performing to design, My maintenance log documents its condition every year for 35 years. Your contractor demolished it on a Tuesday morning without a phone call to me, without a permit, and without a structural engineer's determination that it was unsafe. The figure is $28,500. Sandra had looked at Cliff. Cliff had said, "Sandra, the compensation figure is well documented, and the appraisal methodology is defensible. In a court proceeding, the figure would likely be higher when you add trespass damages for the unauthorized entry and demolition on private property. I'd recommend accepting the figure." Sandra had said nothing for a long moment. She had said, "Fine." Margaret had said, "Term 4. The new easement contains an enhanced maintenance condition and a penalty clause. The maintenance condition requires the HOA to conduct an annual inspection of the crossing structure by a licensed structural engineer. Submit a written inspection report to Mr. Dunning within 30 days of each inspection, and perform any maintenance identified in the inspection report within 60 days. The penalty clause provides that any breach of the maintenance condition, including failure to conduct the annual inspection, failure to submit the inspection report, or failure to perform identified maintenance, results in an automatic $5,000 penalty payable to Mr. Dunning per month of continued breach, with the property owner retaining the right to terminate the easement after 6 months of uncured breach. Cliff had said, "The penalty clause is aggressive." Margaret had said, "The existing easement had no penalty clause. The HOA performed no maintenance for 18 years. The penalty clause ensures that the maintenance condition is treated as an obligation, not a suggestion." Cliff had said, "The HOA will accept the annual inspection requirement and the report submission requirement. The automatic penalty clause, we'd propose a cure notice before the penalty clock starts." Margaret had said, 30-day cure notice before the penalty clock starts. After 30 days of uncured breach, the penalty accrues at $5,000 per month." Cliff had said, "Agreed." The final instrument had been drafted by Margaret over the following week. The acknowledgement and the new easement as 2 separate recorded instruments. The acknowledgement documenting the breach and the termination of the prior easement. The new easement granting fresh access rights with the enhanced maintenance condition and the penalty clause. Cliff had reviewed both instruments and had submitted 2 minor word choice adjustments. Margaret had accepted one and rejected one. The final form had been agreed on a Thursday afternoon by email. The $28,500 compensation had been wired to Margaret's trust account on Friday morning. The signing had been the following Monday. The instruments executed by Sandra Pruitt as HOA president, witnessed and notarized. The acknowledgement signed first, and the new easement signed second. Earl had signed the new easement as grantor, his name on the instrument that gave Ridgeline Estates' 38 families their road back. The grant conditioned on an annual engineering inspection, a written report, documented maintenance, a penalty clause, and the recorded acknowledgement of how the prior easement had ended. The recording had been completed at the Harlan County Register's office by 2 p.m. Monday. Margaret had called Earl at 2:15. She had said, "Both instruments recorded. The acknowledgement is against all 39 parcels. The new easement is recorded. Book 44, page 312. Earl had said, "Send me the instrument numbers." He had written them in his maintenance log. The new easement's recording reference, the date, a single line. New easement recorded. Enhanced maintenance condition. Annual engineering inspection required. Penalty clause in effect. He had driven to the gate at 3 p.m. and had removed the padlock. The gate had swung open on its hinges. Level. True. The swing arc clearing the road surface the way it had cleared it the morning he hung it 43 days earlier. He had driven back to the farmhouse, leaving the gate standing open against the fence post. The road was open. The new easement said what it said. The structural engineer Earl had selected from his list of 3 was a woman named Carol Taft, a licensed bridge engineer out of Knoxville with 22 years of small span structure experience, the kind of resume that included county bridge replacements and private creek crossings and agricultural access structures across eastern Tennessee. Earl had reviewed her portfolio before putting her on the list and had noted that her documented span work was clean. Drawings that showed the calculations, specifications that matched the site conditions, certifications that were specific rather than general. Carol had visited the site in November, walking the creek banks, measuring the span, assessing the footing remnants that Pete Ferris had left when he cut the anchor bolts and hauled the steel away. She had said, "The footings are sound. The concrete is good, and the bearing capacity at this crossing is solid limestone. I can design around the existing footings if you want to keep them. It saves excavation cost, and the bearing condition is better than what I'd get starting fresh. Earl had said, "The footings are mine. I poured them in 1987. Use them if the design works." Carol had said, "The design works. I'll spec a steel I-beam structure with a concrete deck. More durable than timber, lower maintenance cycle. The concrete deck eliminates the plank replacement issue entirely. 15-ton load rating is required." Earl had said, "The deck surface needs to handle a loaded hay wagon and a fuel delivery truck." Carol had said, 15 tons handles both with margin. I'll have the drawings to you in 3 weeks." The drawings had arrived on schedule, 6 pages, the calculations attached, the bearing plate layout designed around the existing footing bolt patterns. Earl had reviewed them at his desk with the same attention he had applied to his own 1987 drawings. The span calculations, the beam sizing, the deck reinforcement, the bearing connections. He had found one item to discuss, the deck drainage slope, which Carol had set at 1%, and which Earl had asked to increase to 2% based on his 35 years of watching water sit on a flat creek crossing deck in a Tennessee rain. Carol had revised the drawings. The revised set had gone to the county for permits. The HOA had hired a bridge contractor from the approved list, a firm called Ridge Span Construction, whose principal, a man named Dale Womack, had built 14 creek crossing structures in the region, and whose work Carol Taft had inspected twice on prior projects. Dale had submitted a construction schedule: mobilization in February, footing preparation in week 1, steel erection in week 2, deck forming and pour in weeks 3 and 4, cure and finishing in week 5, final inspection in week 6. He had hit the schedule within 3 days on every milestone. The final inspection had been on a Friday morning in late March. Carol Taft on site with her inspection checklist, Dale Womack walking her through the completed structure, Earl present on his bank watching without participating in the inspection process. That was Carol's inspection. He would make his own after she was done. Carol had spent 40 minutes on the structure, the bearing connections, the beam condition, the deck surface, the drainage slope, the load rating placard mounted on the downstream rail post. She had written her inspection report standing on the deck with her clipboard, transferred it to the formal report format in her truck, and had signed and sealed it before she left the site. She had handed Earl the sealed report. She had said, "The structure meets the design specifications. Load rating is confirmed at 15 tons. The deck drainage is performing. I watched it sheet off cleanly when Dale ran water on it this morning. The bearing connections are tight and properly torqued. The footing interface is solid. I'm satisfied with the construction." Earl had said, "Thank you, Carol." She had driven away. Dale Womack had shaken Earl's hand and driven away. The site had gone quiet. The creek running below the new structure. The March morning cold. The road on both sides of the crossing intact and waiting. Earl had stood on his bank for a moment and had then walked onto the bridge. He had walked it the way he walked the 1987 structure every October, from the county highway end to the subdivision end, slowly, looking at the deck surface, the rail posts, the beam flanges visible at the deck edges, the bearing plates at each end. He had knelt on the deck at the midpoint and had looked at the concrete surface, Carol's 2% drainage slope visible as a subtle crown, the deck edges clean where the forms had been stripped. He had stood and had looked downstream at the footing faces, visible below the beam ends. His 1987 concrete, the new bearing plates anchored to the old bolt patterns. The two structures connected at that interface in a way that made the new bridge partly his from the beginning. He had looked at the load rating placard on the downstream rail post, a stamped aluminum plate, the engineer's seal in the lower right corner, the text reading, "Private Crossing, Ridge Road, Tanner Creek, Load Rating, 15 tons, Design Engineer, C. Taft, P.E. Construction completed, March 2023. Annual inspection required per Recorded Easement Book 44, page 312. He had read the last line twice. Carol had added it without being asked. The easement reference on the load rating placard. The annual inspection requirement stated in plain text on the structure itself. He had not requested that. She had understood that it belonged there. He had walked back to the county highway end and had stood at the gate he had hung in September, The gate he had padlocked for 43 days, and then opened when the new easement was recorded. The gate stood open against the fence post where he had left it the afternoon of the recording, held back by the latch he had set against the fence to keep it from swinging in the wind. He had looked at the open gate and the new bridge beyond it, and the road running through to the subdivision in the March morning. He had taken his phone from his pocket and had photographed the placard, the load rating, the engineer's seal, the easement reference. He had photographed the bridge from the county highway end, the full span, the concrete deck, the steel rails, the creek below. He had noted the time, 8:23 a.m. He had walked back to the farmhouse and had opened the 5th composition notebook. The new maintenance log he had started the day the new easement was recorded, the prior 4 notebooks filed in the cabinet beneath it. He had written the first entry in the new notebook. March. Bridge construction complete. Steel I-beam, concrete deck. Span, 22 feet. Load rating, 15 tons. Design engineer, Carol Taft, P.E. Construction, ridge span construction. Final inspection completed and certified. Deck surface sound. Bearing connections solid. Drainage performing to specification. Footing interface solid. Original 1987 footings incorporated in new design. Load rating placard installed with easement reference. Structure performing to design. He had written one more line. HOA maintenance obligation in effect. Annual engineering inspection required per Book 44, page 312. First HOA inspection due October 2023. He had closed the notebook. He had put on his work coat and his hat and had gone out to the hayfield. The March morning, the field coming out of winter, the ground soft at the edges where the drainage ran. The tractor was in the barn where he had left it in November. He would service it this week and begin the spring field preparation next week and run the first cut in May when the grass was ready. Ridge Road was open. The new bridge was carrying the morning's first commuters across Tanner Creek, the Ridgeline Estates families driving to the county highway in the time it had always taken them, the crossing smooth under their tires, the concrete deck solid, the 15-ton structure carrying their vehicles with the same unmarked competence that Earl's 1987 structure had carried them for 35 years. The easement said what it said, the maintenance condition in plain language, the annual inspection requirement, the penalty clause, the acknowledgement of breach recorded against all 39 parcels in the county's permanent deed records. The bridge was Earl's to inspect, the HOA's to maintain. That was how it was always supposed to work. He went to the hayfield.